Good morning. It is June 29th, and it's time for our daily dose of good news. Today we're reading from Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 31. And like the rest of Leviticus, it tends to be a technical book full of specificity, and this passage is no different. When a woman has a discharge of blood, that is her regular discharge from her body, she shall be in her impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. Everything upon which she lies during her impurity shall be unclean. Everything also upon which she sits shall be unclean. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until the evening. Whoever touches anything upon which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything upon which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. If any man lies with her and her impurity falls on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies during all the days of her discharge shall be treated as the bed of her impurity, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening. If she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. On the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement on her behalf before the Lord for her unclean discharge. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, so that they do not die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. Here ends the reading. Now, take a breath, because I realize some people might feel squeamish about that passage. But our God is one that wrote about the technicalities of a woman's cycle, or about circumcision, or about the crucifixion of Christ. So that tells me our God is messy, or is at least in the mess, willing to talk about the mess, kind of earthy. So, we might be squeamish at things that get our hands dirty or that aren't neat and pretty. That's not where our God lands, though. Okay? So our God talks about things that might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but I'd like to talk about this text a little bit today because there's a lot of symbolism, particularly at the end, related to the blood, that the blood is connected with uncleanness and it's connected with sin. And so at the end, the priest goes and makes atonement for her, and that cleanses her. Okay, so that's going to be symbolic of what Christ is doing on the cross when Christ comes and does his ministry on earth, right? That Christ comes and is crucified, which is a bloody way of death. And we know that the crown of thorns are jammed in his head. That would have caused probably some blood. We know that he's been lashed or whipped, and that his back has got 39 strikes on it. That would have been bloody. We know that to check if he was dead, there was a sword put in his side. That would have been bloody. Okay? So our God is not squeamish about that. But in Old Testament times, when you look back at the restrictions that God placed, they were generally all for people's health. That they were trying to reduce disease and help the population thrive and prosper in ways which were healthy. So there was separation. There was maybe some hyperness about trying to keep things clean. Okay, we've just lived through some hyperness. Is that a word? I don't know if that's a word, but we'll call it a word. In terms of the pandemic, right? You wash your hands for 20 seconds. You put on a mask. You stay away from people. If somebody coughs or sneezes, you back up because you're worried that they might be carrying the pandemic. All right. At the very beginning, you may remember YouTube videos about people explaining how you could disinfect cereal boxes that came into your house or other items, and you could go through your groceries one by one to try and do all these things to prevent disease. Okay. The technicalities and the rules are in place because God was trying to prevent disease. And you may remember in the gospel passage for this past weekend that there was a woman who had bled for 12 years, and we talk about that in Mark. And I want to point out just a couple things about that. One was, we have no indication that it was a vaginal bleeding, okay? We do know it was hemorrhaging, so there would have been quite an extensive amount of it, okay? So one of the things about that I can relate to on this topic is when I did volunteer work in Cambodia, I worked with girls who dropped out of school. Oftentimes in middle school. And one of the primary reasons for that was because they would have their cycle, and because of the embarrassment of not having sanitary products or hygiene components like we have so readily available in the US, that blood was seen. So their clothes would be blood-stained, and they would have a hard time hiding that. So rather than that being known to people, they often would drop out of school for that week. And so they would miss 1 week a month for like an academic year. And by the end of that academic year, they'd be really far behind in terms of catching up. So I give that as an example of how, because that would have been obvious, and that was with vaginal bleeding, not even hemorrhaging. This woman who was hemorrhaging for 12 years, probably every item of clothing she had was bloodstained, no matter how often she washed it. It probably wasn't something she could hide at all. And so she probably was very pulled back from the community because she would have been viewed as impure, and anyone engaging with her would have had to experience all this hyperactivity around what to do to cleanse themselves and how long it had to be before they could rejoin and go worship. So she probably was very pulled back from society and was in a lot of shame because of that, because it would have been so visible to those around her that she had a condition. And in this, when she's healed by Jesus just for touching his robe, one of the things that it says is, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So it's definitely a disease that's causing the hemorrhage, right? So while God puts in places parameters, technicalities, things to keep us from disease, at the same time, God also really wants to heal us of our disease. Heal us over the things that overtake our body, mind, and soul, and that restrict life in all fullness for us. So while that may seem gory to talk about, maybe a bigger picture way of thinking about that is, what are the diseases, what are the sins that are in your life that God wants to remove so that you can be restored to life in all fullness and restored to community? And today, can you acknowledge the reality of those, and can you reach to Jesus, knowing that just reaching to Jesus in and of itself cures you from all your sin, and that you're purified and made whole again? So I invite you to do that today. Enjoy the day, everybody. Bye-bye.